The X-Men, Marvel's band of merry mutants, the strangest teens of all, a badass team sworn to protect a world that hates and fears them. Since debuting in 1963, the X-Men have been a staple. Well, not really, there was many years where they were ignored, but definitely since the 90s, the world knows who the X-Men are, and they are one of the top teams in Marvel, and they're going to be breaching into the MCU very soon, and right now, a classic X-Men cartoon from the 90s is returning in X-Men 97. So I thought this would be a great time to talk about the first 10 members of the X-Men. I am Haussmann Comics. I said my name weird. I'm Haas. How's it going? Let's get into it. X-Men number 1 was the first appearance of the X-Men, and we were introduced to the whole team. Well, I wasn't. I was actually pretty far from being born at the time. Like, first class to apocalypse away from being born. I digress. In issue number 1, we meet the X-Men, Professor Charles Xavier and his team of mutant heroes, Cyclops, Beast, Angel, and the Iceman. And then they're all introduced to... You know what? We'll talk about that later. We're going to come back to this issue. So while the answer to the first few X-Men is actually pretty obvious, we're going to delve into some of the hows and whys and whens, I guess. And then after we get through the first 6, there's some stuff that's probably going to surprise you and maybe you'll learn something. Without further ado, with a little more ado, I have a few things to mention. Canonically, there was a team titled First X-Men by Christos Gage and Neil Adams, and it's set before Xavier formed the X-Men. Wolverine and Sabretooth actually joined forces to create their own team to track down and protect young mutants. A lot like the X-Men would. They even approach a young Charles Xavier to join, but he denies even being a mutant and brushes them off. Long story short, they weren't even technically called the X-Men, and a lot of them died. Okay, so now without further ado, let's talk about Charles Xavier. It seems kind of obvious as the choice for the first X-Men. His first appearance was in X-Men number 1 by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. His origin was revealed in X-Men number 38, which actually kicked off a run of backup stories where they gave several origins. It was pretty cool. Xavier had spent several of the past years in self-imposed exile, but starting to see the world changing and anti-mutant sentiment growing, he decides now's his time to act. He heads towards the FBI building and Jedi mind tricks his way into the office of Fred Duncan, who's the head of mutant investigation. Xavier tells Duncan that if he continues like this, he may push mutants to become the very menace that they fear they will. But if Xavier were to approach the mutants as one of them, it could be beneficial to mankind. So with that, the FBI agrees to give Chuck information and Xavier will report back to them. And the first bit of information they have is a certain orphan on the run after exposing his powers, which we're going to come back to in a minute. But before recruiting Cyclops as the first X-Men, there was another. Her name is Tessa, but she's better known to the world as Sage. She first appeared in X-Men number 132, created by Chris Claremont and John Byrne, and she was a member of the infamous Hellfire Club. But it turns out she was actually there as an undercover spy for Xavier. While he would train his other students to become heroes, before that he trained Sage to become a spy, and thus not technically an X-Men, until like way later, like number 38. Okay, so now the actual number 2. No more fake-outs, no more misleads, that's all out of the way. Scott Summers witnesses an accident, or causes the accident, whichever. A huge air conditioner unit is falling from a crane, and Scott blasts it into nothing with his optic blast to prevent anyone from getting hurt. And in response, the people he just saved turn on him because he's a mutant. Scott goes on the run, he's chased by an angry mob, he's chased by the police, and he eventually finds himself hunkered down with some railway hobos, until they try to beat him up and rob him. But then he is saved by someone who the titles call the first evil mutant, Jack Winters. He's got diamond hands due to an accident, and he wants to make his whole body diamond. I'm not even sure if that would qualify him as a mutant, but we'll dive into that later. With Scott's help, he does actually become a living diamond. I have to wonder if Scott flashes back to some of this when he starts dating Emma Frost. But Xavier comes, and together they defeat the Jack of Diamonds. He has several names in just a few appearances. But Cyclops does become the first official student of Charles Xavier. And not a moment too soon, because elsewhere in America, young Bobby Drake, who looks older than 16, is on a date when some ruffians pick on his gal, forcing him to use his powers, which leads to an angry mob. And I do have to say, his parents are very quick to try and defend him. His dad even wants to step out there, which is a far cry from...
Have you tried not being a mutant?
His dad is ready to leave town to protect the boy when the mob shows up, and he even says, "Dang it, Bobby, stay inside and I'll deal with them." But Bobby ends up actually turning himself in, and he goes to the local jail cell, where Cyclops shows up to bust him out. And the future Iceman refuses to go with him, so quick-thinking Cyclops decides he's just going to beat the crap out of him instead. They actually have quite the fight, and the angry mob shows back up and nearly ends up lynching both of the young mutants before they can break free, and Xavier wipes their memories. Why didn't Xavier just go in first? And Xavier also takes a page out of Hermione Granger and makes Bobby's parents forget that he's a mutant, and Iceman goes off to become the second student of the Xavier Institute for Gifted Youngsters. This next recruit is actually a personal favorite of mine. It's Warren Worthington III, better known to the world as the High-Flying Angel. Or the Avenging Angel, as he was known in his crime-fighting career pre-X-Men. See? He's awesome. Warren grew up rich, so obviously he spent his teen years at a private prep school where he was occasionally teased for his large shoulder blades, which eventually sprouted into wings that he kept hidden, until a fire left him with no choice but to jump out of a window and learn to fly. He also saved the lives of many fellow students that night, which inspired him to don an awesome costume and equip himself with a gas gun,
Suck gas, evildoer!
and go out fighting crime. Cyclops and Iceman do show up to recruit him into the X-Men, but the Avenging Angel says he's strictly a loner. But then he has to fly a bomb up above the city and doesn't solve the icing problem, and then he decides he should join the X-Men. Before I jump into the next X-Men, I'm gonna need you to go and hit the like button downstairs. Realistically though, I can't tell if you hit it or not, so the video is going to continue whether you do or not, but please do. Anyway, so a mutant in the Marvel Universe is someone who is born a mutant. Like Stan Lee was basically, oh, it's a lazy way to make powers. They don't have to be bitten by a radioactive spider or bombarded with any rays, be they gamma, vita, or cosmic. That makes Beast quite the curious case because he was born with mutant abilities, but he also has an origin, explaining them. His father, Norton McCoy, worked in an atomic energy plant and nearly died a hero's death, preventing a meltdown. And a doctor did warn him that exposure to the radioactivity could have strange genetic consequences. And that doctor was right. His son, Hank McCoy, is born with large, fully developed hands and feet. I know the whole mutant thing in comics was about the side effects of the atomic age, and that would lessen as years went on. It was more about evolution. But I'd say Beast's powers are like more of a byproduct of that particular accident than they are a mutation. Therefore, he might not be a mutant. Later, when we get Sunfire showing up, it's the same kind of thing. His mother was in Hiroshima, which obviously doesn't work with the sliding timeline, but his mother was in Hiroshima and got exposed to radiation, and that's probably where his powers end up coming from as well, which is still a mutation, but due to direct influence, right? So does that make Blade a mutant? Because he was born and his mother was bit by a vampire while she was pregnant. Anyway, young Hank McCoy would grow up, he would become quite adept at using his abilities to his advantage and became an all-star for his high school's football team, even stopping 3 crooks during one game. This, of course, drew the eyes of the supervillain named the Conquistador, as such things do. Conquistador kidnapped Beast's parents and forced Hank to work for him. But thankfully, the trio of X-Men showed up and stopped the villain, welcoming Beast aboard as the 5th X-Man. The last of the original X-Men showed up in X-Men #1 by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. That's where everybody first appeared. Like, you remember when I was talking about that a few minutes ago? Yeah, we're gonna flash back to that. In issue #1, we meet the X-Men, Professor Charles Xavier and his team of mutant heroes, Cyclops, Beast, Angel, and the Iceman. And then they're all introduced to... You know what? We'll talk about that later. We're gonna come back to this issue. Good times. Anyway, Jean Grey was there, and she joined the team as Marvel Girl, and they went on their first adventure as a complete team, and they battled Magneto and won the day. Those are the original X-Men, and among some of the most prominent. They would each go through many changes over the years and branch out, joining other teams. Cyclops and Jean would fall in love, and Jean would die. Beast would further mutate himself, also using science, and join the Avengers. The original 5 X-Men would reform as X-Factor, where Angel would be transformed into Archangel by Apocalypse, and Jean would die. Cyclops would turn evil, Beast would turn evil, Iceman would come out as gay, and Jean would inevitably die. This particular team of 5 youngsters would even be brought to the present-day Marvel Universe for even more adventures. Each of these 5 are no doubt iconic X-Men, but I don't think there's anyone that would call this the best roster. Also, that's only 6 X-Men, and I promised you 10. So get ready for number 7, the first recruit to Marvel's merry band of Marvel Merry Mutants, and it's not even a mutant, it's Mimic. He first appeared in X-Men number 19 by Stan Lee and Jay Gavin. Calvin Rankin's father was a scientist, and in an accident, Calvin got the powers to copy the abilities of anyone around him, and a chance encounter showed him that that would include super abilities, namely those of Beast and Iceman. From there, he deduced the true identities of most of the X-Men, and went to gain all of their abilities under the guise of wanting to join the team. So he gains all the power he was after, powers of the 5 X-Men, which is awesome, and they fight, but ultimately he ends up losing all his powers. Though he would regain his abilities and be invited to join the X-Men team for realsies in X-Men number 27, and though tensions were high and no one quite trusted him, he was fighting alongside the team for a few issues. He actually goes mano-a-mano with the Super Adaptoid, ultimately losing his powers again to save the world. Mimic would, of course, get his powers back and keep popping back up over the years on either side of the law. An alternate version of Mimic would gain far more popularity in a book called The Exiles, which was awesome. It was a mix of X-Men and What If and Quantum Leap, and it's so good, you guys. It's so good. And that version actually was a mutant. So the next member to join the X-Men is kind of a technicality, but it's there in the history books. He was an X-Man. Do you remember when Xavier died? Like, for the first time? It was in X-Men number 42, and it wasn't actually Xavier. It turns out it was the Changeling. Actually, it was all a retcon, but Kevin Sidney was a shape-changing mutant. He first appeared in X-Men number 35 as a member of the evil Factor 3. He didn't do much, but try to look cool and end up getting shit on by his boss, so he's pretty relatable. They battled the X-Men and lost, as most bad guys do, and at some point after that, he realized he was dying, and he wanted to make his last moments count, so he came to Xavier for help. But at that same time, Xavier discovered there was an imminent alien invasion, so he needed to disappear to prepare for it. So he made Changeling an X-Man and asked him to take his place. Changeling would then go down in history as the first X-Men to die in the line of duty, because he was being Xavier and Xavier died, and somehow he managed to hold on to Xavier's form even in death, so maybe he needs a little more credit. It's over 20 years later where this kind of gets interesting. I'll assume you're familiar with the X-Men animated series of the early 90s. The Changeling was repurposed for that show and given the name Morph because DC had the copyright on the name Changeling, as that was Beast Boy's name at the time. The character gained popularity on that show and then was reintroduced into the comics in the alternate universe tale Age of Apocalypse, and then that morph would inspire the creation of a very similar morph in the comic Exiles that I was just talking about with Mimic. And then bringing it full circle, the AOA look for morph seems to have been adopted into the relaunch of the animated series. Now, the ninth member of the X-Men may appear more familiar to some of you. It's the green-haired Mistress of Magnetism, Miss Lorna Dane, aka Polaris. In X-Men number 49, the also green Mesmero was working for Magneto, and he used his brain powers to call out to latent mutants and put them into a trance, and that included young Miss Lorna, who was almost schmucked by a car if not for Iceman, who jumped and saved her, and then he got the hot spore or something fierce. Although maybe he had the hot spore and then he saved her, who knows. Eventually, though, she does get to Mesmero, and he triggers her powers and labels her the Queen of the Mutants. Then Magneto reveals himself and says that he's her father. But the X-Men intervene and prove that Magneto isn't her father because her parents died in a plane crash years ago. So interestingly enough, the Magneto that said he was her father would be revealed to actually be a robot that was built by somebody else and I think was tricking Mesmero. And then ultimately, way later in the comics, the real Magneto turns out to actually be her father. Comics. Anyway, in issue number 60, she would join the X-Men officially, but not go on that many adventures with them. Havok would be the 10th member of the X-Men, and the last one we're going to talk about today. He is Alex Summers. He's the brother of Cyclops himself. He appeared in X-Men number 54, where he's kidnapped by the living pharaoh who claims that Alex Summers is the last of a bloodline that can actually kill him. Guess he's just completely ignoring Cyclops, and Vulcan for that matter. The next few issues have the X-Men fighting Egyptian-themed baddies, and Alex eventually triggers his powers and gets his mutant abilities, and he learns to use them a little bit. He gets a costume in a story involving Sentinels. By X-Men number 65, he is officially named an X-Men by none other than the returning from the dead, so we thought, Charles Xavier. Now, Havok and Polaris, they were on and off of the X-Men quite a bit, especially in those early years. They were there on the Adventure in Krakoa, stuff like that. They would go off and kind of leave. They'd fall in love. And eventually, they would be the ones to take over X-Factor, and that's kind of where they gained a lot of their popularity. Polaris would go crazy over the years, and Havok would spend most of his time overshadowed by Cyclops, though I think some great stuff has been done with each of them. There's never quite that top tier of X-Men, right? Although Havok would go on to even have a relationship with Wasp over on Uncanny X-Men. Like, I think there's a lot that can be done with each of them. Lorna went crazy and was just Magneto's daughter and just kind of there. Same with Havok. In the 90s, Havok had a whole series to himself, Mutant X, where he was the main hero of the universe, and he really liked that. It was a good series. It was interesting. Those were the first 10 X-Men. Let me know in the comments below what you think. I forgot to tell you to like earlier. I wasn't going to reveal one of the X-Men until you like it. I'm gonna say that right now. Before I jump into the next X-Men, I'm gonna need you to go and hit the like button downstairs. Realistically, though, I can't tell if you hit it or not, so the video is going to continue whether you do or not, but please do. Anyway, those were the first 10 X-Men. I do have more videos like this planned where I go into the first 10 members of the New Warriors, or the Avengers, or the Teen Titans, or the Justice League, or various things like that, or I can continue on with the next 10 members of the X-Men, because there's a lot of X-Men through the years. Anyway, I want you to stay Hossy, and I will stay Hossy as well. Okay, bye.